There's a certain kind of machine that doesn't just move people, it moves entire generations of adventure seekers. You know the type. Built not for speed, but for survival, shaped by dust, grit, and the stubborn belief that every mountain has a road if you're willing to make one. It's the sound of gravel under heavy tires, the smell of fuel mixing with cold air, the promise that when the pavement ends, the real story begins. Every scratch on the paint tells a story, every dent a victory over terrain that wanted you to quit. But what makes some vehicles transcend utility to become legend? How does a tool for farmers and soldiers evolve into a timeless emblem of freedom and endurance? That's the story we're diving into today. The story of how a machine conquered the world one muddy trail at a time. Like the video, subscribe for more automotive deep dives, and tell us in the comments which classic off-roader we should explore next. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 wasn't born into comfort. It was forged in necessity. When Toyota engineers began developing what would become the FJ40 in the early 1950s, Japan was still rebuilding from the devastation of war, and the global auto market was entering an era of pragmatic innovation. The company needed something durable, simple, and versatile, something that could serve as a workhorse for industry, agriculture, and military use. The resulting design was purposeful from every angle: a short wheelbase for maneuverability, leaf springs for strength, and a body so square and utilitarian, it looked like it was carved out of sheet metal with a ruler and resolve. Toyota didn't try to outstyle its rivals. It outlasted them. The Land Cruiser FJ40 was born from this principle: durability first, comfort later if ever. The earliest prototypes, such as the BJ series, were direct responses to government tenders seeking a domestic off-road vehicle that could replace or rival the American Jeep. But Toyota quickly discovered the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 didn't start as an icon, it started as a necessity. In post-war Japan, the nation was rebuilding its identity, and Toyota, still a young automaker, was fighting to prove that it could make machines tough enough for both military and civilian use. The FJ40 emerged from that crucible as a purpose-built 4x4, a direct response to a request for a rugged, all-terrain vehicle that could match anything from the West. It wasn't built for glamour, it was built for survival. Every line of its design, flat fenders, upright windshield, steel bumpers, spoke to function first. Yet within that utility, something timeless took shape. Toyota's engineers knew they had one shot to prove themselves, so they overbuilt everything. The frame was thick, the axles massive, the mechanicals simple enough to repair in the middle of nowhere with a wrench and determination. It was a truck born from pragmatism but destined for romance. Farmers used it. Miners relied on it, explorers adopted it, and soon, soldiers and surveyors were finding that this machine could go places that seemed unreachable. The world was opening up, and the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was the key to unlocking it. But behind its rise was a quiet kind of genius, an understanding that simplicity, done right, could be unstoppable. Toyota focused on reliability above all else, reasoning that power didn't matter if you couldn't finish the journey. So the FJ40's engine was tuned not for speed, but for torque, grip and pull, the ability to crawl over obstacles instead of blasting past them. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but honest. Vinyl seats, metal dash, nothing fancy to break, nothing frivolous to distract. Every detail had a purpose: ventilation slats to fight tropical humidity, modular panels for easy repair, a removable top for versatility. The FJ40 was designed to serve, not to impress. And that's exactly why it earned respect. In remote corners of the world, African savannas, Australian outback, South American jungles, the Land Cruiser FJ40 became a lifeline. It was the truck you could trust when no one else was coming. Missionaries, medics, and explorers all had stories of these Toyotas dragging them through impossible terrain and somehow always starting the next morning. It was tough in a way that became folklore, and with every success, Toyota's confidence grew. The company realized it wasn't just selling a vehicle, it was exporting reliability as a national identity. By the 1960s, the Land Cruiser FJ40 was ready for America. But Toyota faced a massive challenge. The US market already had rugged brands deeply tied to patriotism and post-war nostalgia. To win over skeptical buyers, Toyota had to prove its machine wasn't just foreign, it was superior where it mattered most. So they let the product do the talking. American buyers who lived on ranches or worked in oil fields quickly discovered that the FJ40 outlasted almost anything. Its mechanical honesty appealed to people who didn't trust marketing promises. It wasn't flashy, but it was faithful. As the decade rolled on, the Land Cruiser FJ40 began to take on a new role, not just a tool, but a companion for adventure. Young Americans yearning for open skies and rough trails saw it as a passport to freedom. It became part of the countercultural movement in its own quiet way, a rebellion against comfort, a return to something raw and mechanical. The FJ40 didn't need to shout to make its point. It just kept going mile after unforgiving mile, and that endurance began to define Toyota itself. Every decision in the FJ40's creation reflected Toyota's growing philosophy. Kaizen, continuous improvement. Early models had their quirks, gear ratios that were too short for highway travel, steering that required muscle, but Toyota kept refining. They didn't rush change. They earned it through iteration. By the mid-1970s, the FJ40 had evolved into a perfectly balanced off-road platform. Strong, simple, adaptable. It could haul, climb, swim, or crawl, and it became the foundation for a family of Land Cruisers that would span generations. The genius of the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was that it made complexity invisible. You didn't have to understand engineering to appreciate what it did. You just had to drive it. The steering might feel heavy, the ride firm, but underneath it all was the reassuring sense that nothing would fail you. That feeling, that trust, wasn't an accident. It was the result of Toyota's relentless testing, from frozen mountain passes in Japan to sweltering dunes in Arabia. The FJ40 wasn't born to impress. It was born to endure. And endurance became its identity. That identity would soon be tested on a global stage. Toyota's engineers had built something durable, but the question remained, could the Land Cruiser FJ40 stand out in a world obsessed with progress, comfort, and style? As the 1970s dawned and SUVs began to evolve from tools into symbols, the FJ40 would need to prove it was more than a relic of ruggedness. It had to prove it was timeless. That's where its story takes a fascinating turn. Because next, we'll see how the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 went from hardworking hero to off-road legend, and why that transformation still defines how we think about durability today. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 entered the 1970s as something rare in the automotive world, a vehicle whose reputation was already mythic, yet whose purpose remained humble. It wasn't built to win beauty contests. It was built to win over terrain. But as markets shifted and technology marched forward, the FJ40 found itself at the crossroads of utility and identity. Toyota had made a truck that could go anywhere, but now the world wanted to know, could it belong anywhere? The global appetite for adventure was growing. In the United States, the back-to-nature movement had taken hold, weekend camping, mountain trails, surf trips down Baja. Americans were ready for machines that could carry them beyond the paved map. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was suddenly the perfect answer to that call. It wasn't glamorous, but that was the point. It looked honest, capable, and ready for anything. While other manufacturers polished chrome and padded dashboards, Toyota leaned into what made the FJ40 special, its rugged authenticity. And ironically, that unvarnished character made it fashionable. By now, Toyota's dealership network in the US had matured, and with it came a reputation for reliability. Customers who bought the FJ40 often came back with stories, not complaints. Word of mouth became its most powerful marketing tool. Mechanics praised it for simplicity. Adventurers praised it for endurance. Even critics admitted there was something disarmingly pure about its mission. It wasn't trying to be everything. It was trying to be one thing perfectly. Of course, perfection in one area often means compromise in another. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was slow on the highway, loud in the cabin, and utterly unapologetic about it. Toyota knew this, but instead of softening the truck, they offered options, different roof styles, seating layouts, and gear ratios, so buyers could tailor it to their own version of hard work or adventure. It was a platform, not just a product. That flexibility turned owners into curators. You could paint it army green or bright yellow, bolt on a winch or remove the doors entirely. It was a blank canvas for utility. Meanwhile, overseas markets were turning the FJ40 into legend. In Africa, it became a tool of progress, used by doctors, aid workers, and governments to reach remote regions. In Australia, it earned a reputation as the toughest truck money could buy, the kind that ranchers passed down like heirlooms. In South America, it was the only vehicle that could climb into mining towns where roads were barely carved into rock. Each market shaped its identity, but all shared one truth. This was the truck you bought when failure wasn't an option. Toyota's confidence in the FJ40 reached the point where the company began to test its limits. The vehicle appeared in cross-country rallies, expedition fleets, and endurance runs, not to show off, but to prove that its reliability wasn't marketing fiction. The FJ40 simply refused to break. Journalists who tested it often wrote about the same phenomenon. After days of punishing terrain, the driver might be exhausted, but the vehicle wasn't. It had a way of outlasting human patience, a trait that turned frustration into admiration. At home in Japan, Toyota engineers studied feedback from every continent and treated it like gospel. They analyzed broken parts returned from remote service points, tweaking metallurgy and design tolerances to make the next version stronger. The Land Cruiser division became almost a cult within Toyota, a team of engineers obsessed with endurance above all else. They didn't care about styling trends. They cared about making a truck that could still run after the world fell apart. That philosophy bled into every bolt of the FJ40, and the results showed. But by the late 1970s, change was unavoidable. Governments were tightening safety and emissions regulations, and buyers were beginning to expect more comfort from their utility vehicles. Toyota faced a delicate challenge: modernize without diluting the essence. The Land Cruiser FJ40 couldn't stay frozen in time, yet any major redesign risked breaking the spell. So Toyota did what it always did: evolve carefully. They added disc brakes, improved cooling, and slightly refined interior materials. Yet the driving experience remained the same: slow, solid, and utterly mechanical. That consistency only deepened loyalty among purists. In the United States, though, competition was intensifying. New SUVs promised plush seats and quieter rides, appealing to families as much as adventurers. Against them, the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 looked and felt archaic. But that was also its strength. Where others sold convenience, Toyota sold certainty. When the road disappeared into mud, snow, or sand, you wanted the FJ40, and plenty of Americans did, especially in rural areas, mountain states, and coastal towns where dependability meant survival. The aftermarket world soon took notice. Off-road shops began fabricating bumpers, roll cages, and suspension kits tailored to the FJ40. The platform's simplicity made it a tinkerer's dream. You could rebuild the carburetor in your garage, swap parts from other Toyota trucks, or weld on your own modifications. It became both a tool and a teacher. Enthusiasts learned mechanics through it, passed down maintenance rituals, and formed clubs that still exist today. In an age before digital tuning, the FJ40 was analog perfection. What you saw was what you fixed. Its cult status only grew as the 1980s approached. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was now both a workhorse and a collector's item in the making. Ironically, the traits that once made it utilitarian, its plain looks, its mechanical honesty, became the very things that made it desirable as newer vehicles grew more complex. By the time Toyota phased out production in 1984, owners weren't ready to say goodbye. The company's next-generation Land Cruisers were bigger, smoother, and more luxurious, but for purists, the FJ40 was the last of the true breed. Around the world, these machines kept working long after production ended. In Africa, they carried vaccines and supplies into the 1990s. In South America, they hauled coffee and copper. In the US, they found second lives as weekend trail rigs and restoration projects. No matter the setting, one thing stayed constant. The FJ40 didn't die. It simply aged into legend. Yet its legacy wasn't just mechanical. It was philosophical. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 had proven that reliability wasn't a feature. It was a culture. Toyota had learned that durability could inspire emotion, that simplicity could breed loyalty stronger than luxury ever could. The FJ40 showed that trust, once earned, could carry a brand across continents. And that trust would become Toyota's defining advantage for decades to come. The story of the FJ40's dominance is one of timing, discipline, and character. It wasn't the fastest or the prettiest, but it was always the one that made it home. That truth resonated across generations and shaped how Americans viewed Japanese engineering. No longer cheap or unproven, Toyota was now synonymous with dependability, and it all started here, in the chassis and soul of the FJ40. As we move into the next part of the story, we'll see what happened after its official goodbye. how the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 refused to fade away, and how it became a touchstone for design, restoration, and adventure culture long after the factory stopped building it. When Toyota officially ended production of the Land Cruiser FJ40 in 1984, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of its immortality. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 had already proven itself in every possible environment, from frozen tundra to sun-scorched desert. But now it was about to enter a new phase, a life sustained by passion rather than production. Few vehicles ever managed to make that leap. The FJ40 did it effortlessly, not through nostalgia alone, but because it embodied values that never go out of style: dependability, honesty, and endurance. The 1980s were a turning point for the automotive world. Technology was racing ahead, computers were creeping into design, and SUVs were evolving into comfort-first lifestyle machines. Yet, as interiors grew softer and suspension smoother, a quiet rebellion began to form among drivers who missed the raw connection of mechanical driving. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 became their rallying point. It represented everything that modern vehicles were losing: the directness of steering, the tactile feedback of metal, the satisfying clunk of a manual gearbox that meant you were part of the process. To drive an FJ40 wasn't just transportation. It was participation. Collectors began noticing early. In rural garages and mountain barns, these old Toyotas sat waiting for rediscovery. Their frames, often rusted but rarely broken, became symbols of craftsmanship from an era when durability was measured in decades, not warranties. Restoration shops popped up across the US, many run by enthusiasts who had grown up watching their parents rely on FJ40s. Some kept them bone stock, honoring Toyota's original vision. Others customized them with modern engines, upgraded brakes, and contemporary comforts. Either way, the spirit remained unchanged. Build it to last, drive it everywhere. Toyota noticed too. The company had moved on to larger, more refined Land Cruisers, but it couldn't ignore the emotional pull of the FJ40. In the early 2000s, Toyota attempted to rekindle that magic with the FJ Cruiser, a modern homage that borrowed the original's round headlights, short overhangs, and upright stance. While not a replica, it captured the attitude: adventurous, unapologetic, and fun. The FJ Cruiser found its own following, especially in the US, and in doing so reminded a new generation that the Land Cruiser name wasn't just about luxury, it was about legacy. But still, purists kept coming back to the original, FJ40. There was something about its simplicity that even modern interpretations couldn't replicate. The Toyota Land Cruiser. FJ40 had become a benchmark for authenticity. In a world of simulated ruggedness, plastic skid plates, digital drive modes, and marketing buzzwords, the FJ40 remained the real deal. It didn't pretend to be tough. It was tough. No traction control, no computers, just metal, gearing, and grit. Its mechanical honesty resonated with a culture increasingly disconnected from its machines. The FJ40 reminded people that adventure isn't downloaded, it's earned. Across the US, restoration scenes flourished. In Colorado, Arizona, and California, shops specialized in frame-off rebuilds that combined the best of both worlds: original aesthetics with subtle upgrades for modern drivability. Some added fuel injection or 5-speed conversions. Others retained carburetors and 3-speed transmissions for authenticity. Prices began to climb, especially for well-preserved US spec models. What was once a farm truck now commanded collector status, fetching 6 figures at auctions. But unlike some collector cars that live under covers, many restored FJ40s still hit the trails. Owners saw them as living legends, not museum pieces. The Land Cruiser FJ40 also began influencing broader car culture. Designers pointed to its proportions: short wheelbase, tall greenhouse, vertical lines, as lessons in functional beauty. Off-road enthusiasts used it as a baseline for what a real 4x4 should be: body on frame, solid axles, and manual locking hubs. Even electric vehicle startups referenced it when discussing durability and design honesty. It became an ideal, a symbol of engineering without pretense. Meanwhile, the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40's endurance continued in the most literal sense. In Africa and South America, many units built in the 1970s and 1980s were still running, still working, still saving lives. Aid convoys and medical teams relied on them where newer vehicles couldn't be serviced. The simplicity that made it old-fashioned in cities made it indispensable in the wild. Toyota's parts network ensured even remote regions could keep them alive. Few vehicles ever achieved such longevity, both mechanically and morally. For US enthusiasts, importing FJ40s from abroad became a niche industry. Right-hand drive versions from Japan or Australia arrived through the 25-year import rule, often with stories etched into their dents and faded paint. Some were lovingly restored, others preserved as found, badges of honor from decades of service. Each one carried that unmistakable presence, square, stubborn, and dependable. You didn't just look at an FJ40, you respected it. The legacy of the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 endures because it bridges two eras, the analog past and the digital present. It speaks to those who believe machines should serve us faithfully, not just entertain us with features. It's the mechanical equivalent of trust, a vehicle that never asked for glory but earned it anyway. And even now, as Toyota continues evolving the Land Cruiser line with hybrid technology and refined luxury, the FJ40 stands apart as the soul of the brand. Ask anyone who has owned one, and they'll tell you the same thing. You don't simply drive an FJ40, you build a relationship with it. You learn its quirks, its rhythms, the slight tug in the steering, the way it hums in low range, its mechanical empathy in motion. Modern vehicles might offer more comfort, but few offer that bond. That's why 40 years after production stopped, the FJ40 is still climbing mountains, crossing deserts, and pulling at hearts. And maybe that's the most remarkable part. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was never designed to be timeless. It became timeless by never changing what it was. A machine that worked so well for so long that it outlived trends, outlasted generations, and outperformed expectations. It's not nostalgia. It's proof that good design doesn't age. It endures. So as we close the story of its production years and look to the modern world, one question remains. What does the FJ40 teach us about building something that truly lasts? The answer lies in what it stood for from day one, reliability as a form of respect. And that's the lesson that still drives the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 forward, decades after the last one rolled off the line.